I want you to look at these champions released in 2021 and tell me how many of them do you think were completely written off as soon as they were released. Not a year later, not after a buff they may have received down the road, but as soon as they came out within the first 3 months, they were just written off completely and they were just champions thrown under the rug. If you ask me, there were quite a bit of these. These are the champions of 2021 and before. Now look at the champions of 2025 and tell me the exact same answer. How many of these were written off completely as soon as they were released? And if you ask me, pretty much none of them. I can give you one, maybe two. 3 is extremely generous if we went to 3. But I'd say 1 or 2 is very fair, and even then I think I can only see one champion that is playable in this image where this happened. Now, what's the difference though? Why were so many champions in 2021 written off completely, and in 2025 it's not the case? Was it just because they had bad damage? Or was it because they didn't have something to do? And that's the question I intend to answer in this video. Why did so many champions in 2021 suck? And why do so many champions in 2025 arguably count as top 5 members of their class? Today we're going to have a little bit of a chat about design space, and specifically if you clicked on this video, you know what I'm going to talk about is why I think 2025 champion design is the best it's ever been. But first we need to understand exactly how the design space works. And I feel like in the game of MCoC, there are 3 different categories where each champion will get released in. Now these categories can overlap, which we'll talk about later, but there are 3 roles that a champion is going to fill. They're either going to be a pretty general attacker, which I'm using the example of Okoye, a champion who takes a lot of different things, both in their class advantage matchup or outside of their class advantage matchup. You could be a defender, such as Yelena, who is obviously meant to be thrown on BG's defense or war defense, with some, of course, attacking potential, but her main role to fill is sitting on defense. And then my third example is a bit of a different one. This is the example of a counter or a targeted attacker rather than a general attacker. And a targeted attacker is usually someone who is specifically designed to take specific defenders in the game, often with their class advantage matchups, and generally not take too much outside of that. Where if you look at Okoye, she's taking a bunch of different defenders that are outside of the science class, like many different defenders just because of how good she is. But Jendal is specifically targeted to be extremely good at fighting Bullseye and other skill defenders that exist. So what exactly is the difference between old and new design when it comes to champions? And we're just going to start with a really simple example of that, taking Symbiote, Spider-Man, and Serpent. These champions both came out about 10 years apart from each other. And it's pretty obvious, because if you look at Symbiote Spider-Man's kit, he has defensive mechanics such as Evade. That is something that was a strong defensive mechanic when he first came out because the game wasn't very broad. The game didn't have that many things going on back then, but he was still considered a defender because back in 2015 when he released, or 2016, something around that time, Evade was one of the biggest problems a champion could have. And now if we look at new defenders and stuff like that, we see Serpent, as just the example I'm providing, as someone who has a laundry list of different defensive mechanics and different things you need to fight Serpent. Back when Spidey came out, you need an evade counter. Now that Serpent's out, you need very specific mystic abilities, such as champions like Spiral, who are going to interact with Power Steel, or just any power control mechanics in general, or someone like Isophene, who's going to have a very strong nullify mechanic or the marked passive. And as you can see over time, things just become much more specific because we have to make new things that champions can do and create new problems to be solved. Because you can't release a champion in 2025 where their sole defensive mechanic is evade and expect them to perform very well with just that defensive mechanic. You have to create new things, and just Symbiote Spider-Man and Serpent is just one example of that. We could go through a laundry list of different 2025 defenders, just 2016 defenders and stuff like that to find different examples. But I think 2016 might be a little bit too early. So what if we moved up to 2022, which is just a year after the champions that I showed at the beginning of the video came out? And we're going to take a look at something that is very interesting about generic versus targeted defender design. And what was the problem with Gore when he released as a defender? You might make the argument that he is a skill-based defender, but that is true. However, there's a problem with releasing skill-based defenders, and that's the fact that they just kind of get destroyed by any generic nuke attacker. And if we look at Dark Phoenix, who is a very modern version of a cosmic defender, you can see that you cannot take Dark Phoenix with any champion. You cannot use a generic nuke to take down Dark Phoenix. You have to have something specific. She is targeted in that matter. She needs targeted RPG mechanics to be able to take her down. You cannot nuke her unless you have one of those targeted attackers. But continuing with the theme of generic versus targeted, let's look at Juggernaut and Spiral. Juggernaut got buffed in 2022, if I remember correctly, so shortly after Gore. Could have been a year earlier, but I'm pretty sure it was 2022, and as you know now, he is the definition of a generic nuke. He doesn't have a lot of abilities, but what he has is a crap ton of damage. And this is a problem, because what that means is that if you have a champion who just has a crap ton of damage, you use them for every single defender in the game, and there is barely any threat anymore. That's the problem with skill-based defenders, because if there are skill-based defenders in the game, you will just use your strongest champion to take them down, and at the end of the day, the goal of MCoC is to broaden your roster, use many just different champions, and try to increase your roster size and diversify it. So if you just want to use the strongest attacker you have, that's not the goal of MCoC. You want to keep changing who is your strongest champion by releasing new things that need countering. And so that's where Spiral comes in, because Spiral comes in to specifically counter Serpent or Dark Phoenix or other cosmic defenders. She's not a generic nuke. She's not here to kill every single defender in the game. What she is here to do is solve the problems the RPG asks that these specific defenders ask for. Meaning that you want to get Spiral because she counters this, but you don't want to get Spiral to take literally everything. That's the beauty of targeted design, because you are able to diversify your roster and give it meaning without only using the same exact characters for everything. So when did this new age of champion design begin? And I think if you ask me, it started in late 2023 with the releases of Photon, Gladiator, and Onslaught, and all for specific reasons. So during this time, champion release had things like Gore, like Hulkling. These are champions who are either generic defender or generic attacker. They either kill something really quick or are a hard defender who gets killed by something who kills very quick, if you understand what I'm saying. But when Photon came out, she was a defender who needed a specific counter or a specific type of mechanic to try to take her down fast. That for her is either defensive ability accuracy reduction or tranquilized. Gladiator came out with a really interesting mechanic in reducing the ability accuracy of armor ups, basically making it to where they don't exist. But Gladiator didn't really have a way to use that then. It didn't take until Red Skull came out as a buff champion to really shine on Gladiator's ability with the armor up ability accuracy reduction, and getting rebalanced as well, because that made the ability accuracy reduction able to happen at the start of the fight. But Gladiator had a very specific ability that just didn't have a reason to exist until targeted design came into play and created that reason for it to exist. And furthermore, Onslaught is another example of a champion who came out specifically as a defender and attacker, but as far as his defender mechanics go, you want to not be metal, you want to be able to interact with neuroshocks in a specific way, and you don't want to inflict him with certain DOT effects. He is a defender who is specifically asking for a bunch of different RPG mechanics. However, he can still be taken by a lot of different champions, but if you want to take advantage of Onslaught's kit or counter him even easier, you want to use these specific RPG asks. And furthermore, Onslaught was a champion who was countering basically every single skill champion when he came out because of how his target design works, with the likes of his non-contact attacks, with the likes of the way he accesses damage, and just many other mechanics, and just destroying the skill class. So what happened exactly with design? Well, the new way that Kabam had been trying to release characters from at that late 2023 point is to create an attacker that counters a defender. or create a defender that is going to highlight the abilities and give value to an attacker. So the example I'm going to use here is Bullseye and Gentle. Bullseye came out, and then after that, Gentle came out specifically with the abilities to completely shut down Bullseye, giving Gentle a reason to exist. And Bullseye, of course, has a reason to exist in scenarios where you can't use Gentle. So they have both design goals to fill, because Bullseye is always going to be a good defender, and because Bullseye is always going to be a good defender, Gentle is always going to be a good attacker, because Gentle is meant to target Bullseye. However, this also works in the reverse sense. In this example, I'm going to use Yelena and Dazzler. When Dazzler came out, she took basically every single skill champion in the entire game with ease, just because of how she worked with countering Thorns, which was a very big threat of skill at the time. But then when Yelena came out, she became a defender in the skill class that Dazzler really couldn't get a good control over, because of the fact that Yelena asks for you to use the new mechanic Daunted. She is going to really target champions who want to increase their own attack, and Dazzler gets a massive Fury on her special too. And Yelena also caps crit damage, so Yelena is trying to ask for champions who aren't relying on big yellow numbers to do damage, which is exactly what Dazzler does. So what Yelena did is she's going to create a reason for other mutants to exist that aren't just Dazzler, because of the fact that Dazzler was just dominating the skill class in general, and we need a new reason to try to chase other mutants. Well, if we release a new skill defender that invalidates Dazzler, then we can find space for other mutant champions to come and shine. That's exactly what Yelena did. So why do I really like this new game design where we introduce a defender and then introduce an attacker? Well, I'm going to go back to the earlier example I used where we looked at 2021 champs, or I think these might be 2022 champs, and show how these champions just didn't have any value when they first came out, but new champions do. If we look at the examples of Icarus, Jubilee, and Silver Centurion, these are just 3 I picked out, there's plenty more to pick from. We can see that when they first came out, they were kind of written off completely. Their damage was probably fine, their damage was decent or really good in some champions' cases, but they didn't really have any utility that mattered. If they didn't have the highest damage in the game, they didn't have a reason to be played, because defensive RPG mechanics didn't really exist yet to create a reason to use champions who have lesser damage than the highest in the game. Because of the whole point with new defenders having RPG mechanics, it means that champions with lesser damage actually can be used. Jubilee, Icarus, and Silver Centurion's damage was fine, if not pretty good. But if they can't compete with the best damage in the game in the year of 2021, that's all that mattered. But if we look at new champions like Bastion, Jean Grey, or Carolina Dean, these champions all know where their value comes from. Jean is here because Yelena is here. Bastion's here because Onslaught is here. Carolina Dean is here because Onslaught's here. We know exactly where these champions shine, what utilities make them good, and even if their damage isn't a nuke, none of these champions have nuke damage. Maybe Carolina Dean, her damage seems very good. But the reason they have such a shining moment in the game is because of the defenders that create the value to them. No longer are so many champions getting pushed under the rug because they don't have something to do, like the 3 champions on the left. Now champions look like the 3 champions on the right, who have a specific purpose in the game because of the defenders creating this specific purpose for them. And that is the beauty of the new age of champion design to me. Now, of course, it goes without saying that there are going to be exceptions to the rule. For instance, if you look at a champion like Titania, she doesn't really have any utility that is meant to counter a specific defender. She's just good. She is just a flat-out good champion because of exactly what her kit does. She just gets to a special 3, basically locks the opponent down, and kills them. That is sometimes all that matters to make a champion good, which is why I think Titania is a little bit overtuned in that matter. She just does everything really, really well. And she might be losing a little bit of value recently, but she's still Titania. She is still one of the strongest science champs in the game. And furthermore, if we look at Joaquim Torres, I don't think he is one of the stronger champions in 2025 at all. I think he's probably the worst champion, specifically because he doesn't have a defender he is really meant to shine against. Like, Enchantress, of course, is part of where the target is, but Spider-Woman exists to do it better, many other science champions exist to do it better, and we can see kind of what he's trying to do with the slow, with the debilitates. We can see a little bit of that, but I don't think that he has enough to really shine yet. Maybe the next Mystic Defender is going to create his value. Like, maybe Joaquim Torres will look a lot better once we get a new Mystic Defender. Or maybe he's going to be a victim of the rebalance program, and we're going to get a much better Joaquim Torres soon. I don't know, but who knows what the future holds for Joaquim. All I know right now is he's an exception to the rule of champions having something immediately valuable as soon as they're released, because I don't think he is able to do that. So for this graphic specifically, I'm adding this after recording everything else for the video, so forgive me if I talk about this topic a little bit later or earlier in the video where I didn't really think about it, but I'm going to break down a little bit more about the problem with every defender being skill-based, because I know there are so many players who hate the RPG aspect of the new defenders and want all defenders to be skill-based, like Kindred or Arcade like I have here. And then we have our RPG-based defenders, Bullseye and Captain Britain on the right. Here's the problem with skill-based defenders. I understand that a lot of the player base likes them because they're rewarding you for having a higher skill, and that's a good thing. Some champions like Onslaught, who are both a really good combination of skill and RPG, really work out well. But the problem with skill-based defenders is something that I probably mentioned a little bit earlier. And that's that if you have a skill-based defender in the game, you really want to use only the strongest champions on your account. The champions who are going to kill stuff the quickest. For instance, Torch is pretty much just the nukiest nuke in the entire game. And you use him for Kindred because he nukes Kindred. Not because he counters Kindred, but because he nukes the crap out of him. And you use Torch for pretty much every other skill-based defender, one that isn't an RPG champion, because nukes just kill things the fastest. And you don't need to worry about the defender mechanics if you can just kill them the fastest. That's a problem, because you can't use Torch for everything. That goes against the goal of the game, to diversify, increase, grow your roster. You want to be able to do new things with a variety of different characters and not trying to do one thing with just the same character. And that's where RPG defenders come in. They are creating the reason for new champions to be something you want. Bullseye makes it to where you want Gentle. Captain Britain makes it to where you are going to want the Maker. The reason Kabam is making defenders that are RPG based is not because of just money. Of course, money is part of it. They need to make money to keep the game going. They need to try to get you to buy the new thing to keep the game going. But it's also because they know that the goal of the game is to increase your roster and have a reason to do that. For example, if a new champion comes out like Psycho Man, where they just don't really have a reason to exist, you're not going to try and go get them. You're not going to try to spend money in the champ. You're not going to try to rank them if you do get them to increase your roster. There's just no point in the champion. But if you create attackers who specifically have a reason to exist by creating a defender that makes them want to exist, then you have a reason to go get the character. You have a reason to spend money. You have a reason to use the items that the game gives you. And if all defenders were skill-based, that's not the case. You go for the fastest killing attacker, and you brush under the rug all the champions who have specific RPG utility. And that is why I don't like skill-based defenders used in an excessive sense. I think some skill-based defenders make sense. If we have a couple arcades a year, I do not mind, but I do think we need to have a lot of Bullseyes or Captain Britons in the game, not just for Kabam to make money, but for us to be able to have a reason to grow our rosters. So let's look at an example of how the new champion value cycle works, because how I've talked about it, where a new thing comes out and then a new counter to that new thing comes out and then a counter to that new thing comes out, It's all something that's in my head, but if I put it on paper, I can show you exactly what I'm talking about. In this case, I'm going to use Nick Fury first. Nick Fury is a skill defender with a very specific ask: counter his life model decoy, or be able to deal with the many other defender threats he has with his unblockable and stuff like that. Dani Moonstar is meant to counter Nick Fury. She has the marked passive. She is going to shut off his healing with her neuro arrows and stuff like that. But Dani can't counter the next skill defender that comes out, which is Attuma. Because Attuma has too much thorns for her to control. She's going to be able to kill him fast because she has good damage, but not before the thorns really take away her health. And that's where Dazzler comes in. Dazzler comes out as a champion who is designed to counter Thorns mechanics, but as I talked about earlier, Yelena comes out, and then Dazzler's value goes a little bit down because she can't counter the new skill threat, and that's when Jean comes in, a champion who actually released a couple months before Yelena, because let's remind ourselves that new attackers can get value that comes into play later in their life rather than immediate sometimes as well. And Yelena coming out 2 months after Jean is a good example of that. But Jean is designed to counter Yelena because of how her Daunted mechanic works, because of her force field absorbing the chip damage, the exhaustions reducing Yelena's crit through the block damage, and many other things. And it's just the value cycle keeps going, because we're going to see a skill champion who comes out that Jean can't take, and then we're going to see a mutant who counters that new skill champion, and it's just going to go on and on and on. And while that might sound like a bad thing to some people, I think that's really good. The reason for that is because you need a reason to chase the new thing in the game. And I know people are just going to say, oh, it's only to feed the whales, but every player needs a reason to increase their roster. So if we don't create a new reason to pursue the new thing, then why do you even play MCoC? Like, you need to get new things, keep finding new champions that you want added to your roster, and at the highest level, a new top champion, because that's the goal of the game, to make your roster go bigger, go broader, use as many different characters as possible, and find many new things that you can do to counter something else. A couple more things I want to bring up before we move on to the next part of the video, and I want to look at how the cycle might work if we went backwards. For instance, if we look at Jean Grey, she is able to counter the Thorns mechanic of Attuma very well. So she can go like backwards in the cycle and still have value for that skill defender in Attuma because of another aspect of her kit. But this isn't always the case. I'm going to use the example of Penny Parker in the tech class to really clear this up. Penny Parker is a defender who came out, and then immediately a bunch of other counters to her came out afterwards, and she lost a lot of defensive value very quickly. But now, some of those counters are 6-star locked, some of those counters aren't always good for every single BG's meta, but if we keep releasing more Cosmic Champions who completely annihilate her, then Penny just doesn't have any defensive threat anymore. But with the way the value cycle has progressed, a lot of Cosmic threat now comes from Incinerate, because you see a lot of the modern tech defenders being vulnerable to Incinerate, being Zola, Arcade, and Sentinel. So that's what Phoenix and Carolina Dean are trying to do. Carolina Dean, the newest Cosmic, Phoenix, the newest buffed Cosmic, but they're not good for Penny Parker. Meaning that while sometimes the cycle will work in reverse, not always does it do that, and it still leaves some room for defenders in the past to have some value. I mean, look at Korg. He's still a bit of a menace on defense sometimes, but maybe not what he used to be, but the cycle doesn't always go backwards. It doesn't always go backwards enough to where stuff of the past is completely irrelevant. Of course, some defenders, like maybe Killmonger, are just kind of shadows of the past now, but Penny Parker and Korg, they're still going strong, and other defenders of the past are still going to be able to because of how design space changes. So quickly looking back at 2025 champions, let's go over exactly what the design for these champions are intended to do, and show exactly what they're trying to do to shine. And starting with Okoye is pretty much a generalist. She is one of the maybe exceptions to the rule, because she's not exactly here to counter a specific defender. She's obviously very good for Photon and other science champions, but she goes beyond that and takes champions like Bullseye, and takes a bunch of just generic stuff, because of the fact that her damage is just so high. But if we move to Gentle, you can see exactly where the targeted game design comes in, because Gentle is meant to be able to counter Bullseye. He's got tools to counter Yelena and such, and other skill champions, because he's got that crazy physical resistance on his special 2, so he's going to be able to counter Thorn's mechanics, but Bullseye is the primary target for Gentle. And moving on to Zola, he is creating new game design as a defender. Zola's a champion who is asking for the attacker to be able to have easy access to their heavy attack, so creating value for Deathless Thanos, new champions like Carolina Dean, who we come to later, and any champions who are able to do a bunch of damage in red, damage on basic attacks that aren't from a special attack, so he's trying to lock out some attackers who are only doing damage on their specials, and then create a reason to chase champions who have a bit more of that heavy charge from a combo mechanic. Joaquim Torres, we talked about earlier, he's another exception to the rule where he doesn't really have a lot of reason to shine, but we can see what he's trying to do. He is trying to be able to counter Mystic Unstoppable mechanics. He's trying to be able to counter Enchanters with his debilitates. And I think that Joaquim Torres is going to get a rebalance to further increase the value that he has in those mechanics. Or we're going to see a new Mystic Defender soon who is going to have some kind of evade or unstoppable mechanic that Joaquim Torres is going to be able to deal with. Jean Grey, we can see how she has value because of her Thorns countering mechanic for the many different skill champions we have. Furthermore, she's able to counter skill miss or just miss in general with defenders such as Lumitrix, which we're going to see later. And also the Daunted mechanic for Yelena, which we're going to see later. She does, quite frankly, a lot because of the different skill defender mechanics that have been created to give her value. Bastion is here to counter Onslaught because of the way he deals with energy damaging effects. Bastion is also a good option for Bullseye. He was specifically a really good counter in design for Bullseye because of the way his pursuit works. However, he does want to emphasize on mutant evade. Champions like Nightcrawler or maybe a future mutant defender that comes out who does have an evade mechanic, he is really going to be targeted at that. Now moving on to Spider-Woman, obviously Enchantress is clearly the mechanic they were going for here, but she's also a really interesting way of dealing with unstoppable and miss mechanics from other champions as well because of how she interacts with evade. And she's also trying to broaden the design space with Power Sting, where you're doing a champion who has a lot of Power Sting damage but also is doing a lot of stuff on the basic attacks, to where you're not limited to just using Power Sting for champions like Spider-Ham. She's able to do quite a bit of damage on basic attacks as well, which is something I think was being experimented on for a Power Sting champion. And moving on to Lumitrix. Lumitrix's big design goal, I think, was his endurance. Try to broaden the science defender class when it comes to wanting attackers that are going to reduce the duration of debuffs and not necessarily purify them. This is kind of in play when it comes to countering Photon, because you don't really get a lot of benefit from purifying the debuffs against Photon, because she's still gonna gain charges. And while she's still gonna gain charges when they expire faster with Lumitrix, you're also looking at the fact that when Photon has her Sig ability, she is going to be causing you to suffer consequences for having debuffs on you, get rid of those debuffs faster, and Lumitrix is succeeding. So I don't think it's like a perfect example of why Endurance is valuable. I think we're going to see a lot more reason to chase Endurance in the future. Maybe it's with High Evo, maybe it's with another Science Defender down the line. Okoye is also a champion who's trying to mess with Endurance, which I talked about earlier. But I think Lumitrix is really going to be a champion who's going to shine later in the game with his endurance, and also just how he worked with his tracking and his miss mechanic, because honestly that tracking is really, really strong. His unblockable mechanic for countering auto block from science champs is clearly going to be used for Evo as well. And he's a bit of a mystery. I'm really interested to see how he progresses in the future. And then we have Dark Phoenix, a defender who is asking for champions to not use Nullify, not use Stagger, not use Neutralize, because that's what Serpent wanted you to do. She is trying to create a reason to use other buff control mechanics, such as Destroy, such as Atrophy, such as Fate Seal. Where Serpent specifically turned off Fate Seal, Dark Phoenix is asking for you to use Fate Seal. Maybe specifically in the example of Hood, because I don't think that I don't think that long shot's going to be good for her, obviously. And we might see more Fate Steel characters come down the line eventually. However, buff immunity is another big one. As we're going to see with Nico Minoru, Dark Phoenix is very vulnerable to buff immunity, so we are going to see more buff immunity come into play, as with Serpent. And then sooner or later, we're going to see a Cosmic Champion who is not going to be able to work with buff immunity to where we want to find more mystics to chase and stuff like that. Because right now, Nico is kind of eating all that design space, so we're going to see another Cosmic Defender that Nico isn't going to be the best for down the line, I'm sure, as well. Yelena is a champion who is trying to make the attacker do attacking mechanics, but don't increase their own attack rating. Champions like Shothra is a big example of that, because I think Shothra is really good for Yelena because of the fact that she does all her damage without needing an attack increase. And other champions like Jean and Onslaught are good examples of that. Yelena is asking for you to try to have that daunted mechanic, try to not increase your attack rating, and deal with her bleeds, not by being immune to them, but by being resistant to them. And like I said, with Jean and with Onslaught, and also other DOT characters like Deadpool, that's what she's trying to get you to do, is use those specific mutants who aren't really trying to just be generic prowess gaining mutants, or someone like Dazzler, where they really want to increase their own attack rating. You need a different type of mutant to be able to take Yelena, and that's exactly what her job is. And if we look at Nico, Nico is here to kind of just use the new buff immunity mechanic. And I say new because it hasn't really been used since Clairvoyant. So it's basically a new thing at this point, especially when Clairvoyant is still 6-star locked. And Nico is trying to be able to take advantage of those Cosmic Defenders who have ways around Nullify, Stagger, Fate Seal, Neutralize, and stuff like that by creating a new, different way of controlling buffs. We have Destroy already, but now we also have buff immunity. Again, I'm still calling this a new mechanic because Claire is in the 7-star, basically. And really try to experiment with how that buff immunity is going to create value for Cosmics now, and maybe not Cosmics future. Because if you look at the Cosmic Defenders, Nico counters all of them. Nico is kind of just OP, honestly, because every single Cosmic Defender she is good for. So I'm almost certain that the next Cosmic Defender we see is not going to be something that Nico can take. Carolina Dean is experimenting with her Instinct buff for sure, and trying to be able to parry non-contacts that a lot of tech champions are releasing, such as obviously Zola is the primary example. And then also try to find easier ways to use the heavy attack. This was kind of brought up with Arcade as well, where you really want to get a heavy attack off against Arcade. And then also with Zola, of course, we are just trying to find exactly an easy way to launch your heavy when Carolina is kind of trying to do that. And again, the Instinct I talked about, she's also using the Pulverize mechanic a good bit, which is a newer mechanic, that she's trying to utilize with a different way to deal with armor up buffs. And then looking at Maker and Evo, I'm not really going to talk about these too much, but you can see Maker's clearly designed for Onslaught, but also Captain Britain when she comes out as a 7-star. She's technically out as a 7-star now, but people will start getting their hands on her in a couple months more. And I think Maker is clearly going to be like the best champion for Captain Britain once she becomes a pretty meta defender. Because I think Captain Britain's going to really shake up the meta as a defender when she comes out as a 7-star to more people. And Maker is going to just be the immediate option for that. Also using the new Power Siphon mechanic. Also the instant effect reduction, instant siphon or something. That's going to be something that could be used for the future. And he just has a bunch of different mechanics I think are going to be really interesting for the future, but not necessarily now. Similar to Jean with Yelena. I think we're going to see a lot more from the Maker in the future, rather than currently in July in 2025. And then High Evo is to be the new Science Defender. We don't really have a great defending class in the Science class, but High Evo is going to shake that up with his combo detonation mechanic, trying to get you to use skill champions who are able to increase that combo easily, giving Yelena and Okoye immediate value, and trying to devalue champions who don't gain their combo as fast. Purify isn't good for High Evo. Ability accuracy reduction isn't good for High Evo, so he's trying to lock out champions like Crossbones to where they're not used for every single Science champ in the game and stuff like that. So that's just a quick summary of how I think all the design for these 2025 champions is looking and how it could look in the future. So the final question I want to bring up to all of you before I sign out with my last point is the design space moving too fast? Are we going too fast in the game to where players can't necessarily keep their rosters going at the pace needed to survive? It's a question that I've thought about for a while now in the making of this video, and the answer that I have for you is I don't know. I really don't know if the game is moving too fast. I mean, clearly Kabam thinks this is the correct way to go. Otherwise, maybe we wouldn't get, like, Cosmic be the strongest defender class with, like, 4 of the strongest defenders in the game, and 2 of them being insanely difficult defenders, RPG-wise being Serpent and Dark Phoenix, being released almost just 1 year within each other. So, are we going too fast where we can't keep up with getting a Mystic countered Serpent and getting a Mystic countered Dark Phoenix? Well, let's think about it. Some of those overlap. So, like, you can use Shothra, Isophene, and Spiral for Dark Phoenix and Serpent, and all of which do pretty decently well. White Tiger as well is another one. If you have the Deep Wounds Mastery, you're able to do that matchup pretty well. But there is still some overlap where there still isn't some overlap where, like, a counter to Serpent necessarily isn't a counter to Dark Phoenix. And this is definitely more of the case in some other classes as well. Not much that I'm going to get into right now, but it's like, our roster is able to keep up with the changes. My roster is, because I have one of the stronger rosters in the game. But if you are a player who has a smaller roster than me, are you able to keep up? And I don't know. I'm not that player. I think that everyone will have the ability to, because of the way these RPG mechanics work. They're usually not too narrow. They can be very narrow, like you might not have a Serpent counter on your roster. I think that's pretty unlikely. You might not have a Yelena counter on your roster. I think that's also pretty unlikely. But the rate at which you have to rank them up, does that feel too fast? And I don't know. It might. At the same time, it might be the correct speed for your roster to be progressing. Call me a Kabam shill all you want, but like I do think that it might be moving a little bit faster than it should be, but also I think the speed is something that's really important. So that's just my thoughts on it. I don't have a great answer as to if the design space is moving too fast, but I'm satisfied with the speed it's going, but I think there is a world where we are moving a little bit faster than we should be. Maybe that'll slow down in the future. As of now, it doesn't look like it is, but who knows what the second half of 2025 and the first half of 2026 has in store for us. So, now to my final comments. But at the end of the day, the whole point of this video is to praise the fact that all these new 2025 champions are really good. Except for the few exceptions that are obviously going to happen every now and again, you could make an argument for almost all of these characters to be in the top 5 of their respected class. These champions all have value to bring to the table. They are all something you want to have right now, and that's because of the new design choices that Kabam is going through. No longer are we receiving as many champions such as Psycho Man, Silver Centurion, Jubilee, and other champions just immediately get pushed under the rug, because we know what these champions are doing. If you look at a YouTube video of people calling Maker as an example, just an immediately underwhelming champion, give him time. He's going to be good. And I think he's even better right now than people realize, because I know what Maker's doing, and it's just a matter of time before people find out what he is going to shine at. So, never write off a champion immediately. They are going to have value, I promise you. So, I hope this video was enjoyable to you. I hope you enjoyed listening to it and can understand a bit of where I'm coming from. I know this isn't something that everyone agrees with, but you need a reason to chase the new thing. You need a reason to increase your roster, and that's exactly what this is doing. And I'm so happy that we aren't getting champions anymore who are just immediately nothing. And it feels so great when these new characters have something to bring to my roster. So, thank you guys so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.